Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the monthly meeting of the Tucson Amateur Astronomy Association. We meet at the U of A at Stewart Observatory once a month, the first Friday usually of every month. And we're delighted to have people here who are here in person, who are here on Zoom, and I assume maybe some people on Facebook. Yes, we've got Facebook going now, and so we're all set up. We will ask that people who are in attendance in the room make sure to not talk during the meeting, because as long as the Zoom is on, it can pick up any conversation in the room. And you may not know that it's being picked up on Zoom, but it may well be picked up on Zoom. So we prefer that people that are in attendance in the room not talk during the meeting until we get the Zoom turned off. And then you can have plenty of times to chat after that. So this evening, we have a guest speaker with us who has been here periodically to talk with us over the years and always has some really interesting things to say. And we're looking forward to his contributions tonight. We have Dr. John Barentine with us tonight, and he used to work directly with and be employed by the DarkSky Association, and now he still works with them, but he's working in a private capacity, and he comes and updates us maybe once a year on things related to dark skies. So we're so glad to have him with us tonight. And John, if you're ready, I think we're ready to start.
Okay, thank you, May. Can everybody hear me? I can hear myself, so that's a good sign. Okay, let me get my slides started here. And thank you, May. Thank you to Terry for inviting me to come back. It's always great to address this group, and it's a real pleasure. There are familiar faces in the crowd, and I want to get to the point that I don't have to come give you these talks anymore, because we've solved this problem and everything is great and dark skies are everywhere. And astronomers are very happy about that. So I was here last a little over a year ago, and I was talking to you then about what we had just started off doing. And that was we rebooted the Southern Arizona chapter of Dark Sky International, which had kind of gone dormant in recent years. And we brought in some new people and new voices who were really enthusiastic about trying to make a difference in our region. And so I'm here a little over a year later to tell you kind of what we've been up to, where we have had some successes, where we've kind of hit the mark, but also thinking about this longer term, bigger picture. I want to keep everybody focused on what the ultimate prize is. And that's a regional situation with our outdoor lighting and our night sky quality that we can really be proud of, and will continue to lead the world, I think, as it has for a long time. So what I'm going to talk to you about over the next about 40 minutes or so will be focused on these three topics. So first of all, I don't have to go into great detail with this group as to why light pollution is a problem. You've already heard me talk about that. I'm going to get right to the punchline with that, and then move into a little bit of the backstory about our chapter, how we reorganized ourselves, what specifically we have been doing in that regard. I'll tell you about some things like our strategic plan that we've come up with. I'll tell you about the activities that we've been engaged in, the ones that have been more productive, the ones that have been maybe less productive, and that we need to put some more energy into. And then I'll wrap this up with some strategies to bring our region back in some respects. I think we're still leading the country and in many respects leading the world, but I'd like to see us do better. And I'm going to talk to you about what I think the ideas are for that. So first up, a very brief review of light pollution. And I'm going to skip right to the punchline. This is a plot that I think I showed you last time that is still fairly new. This was published about a year and a half ago. And it is in one graph, I think, the best representation of what's happening in the world with light pollution right now. And to reduce some of the complexity here, what I'm showing you is results from the Globe at Night citizen science program that's been running for the better part of 20 years now. They run it right across the street at Noir Lab, but they accept observations from thousands of people all over the world where they're asked to do one simple thing at some point during the year around the time of new moon, and that's to go find a fairly easy to locate constellation in the night sky and to count stars. And by counting stars, they can figure out what's the least bright of those stars that's visible from a location. And we know that that correlates very well with the brightness of the night sky that we would measure through other kinds of instruments. So this is the result of many, many thousands of individual observations all put together. And what I'm showing you on the vertical axis is that limiting magnitude. What's the faintest star that a person can see in Orion or in Leo or a constellation like that? And the numbers are getting bigger going up the axis, so that means fainter going that way. And the other axis is a different independent measurement of the night sky brightness that's set to the year 2014, just as an anchor point in time. So when we plot points in this space, they tend to lie along more or less straight lines because of that relationship between sky brightness and limiting magnitude. And what I want you to notice in this particularly is that they've picked out 2 years here that span a range of time of the study. One of those is the year 2011, which are those sort of magenta colored points. And the other year is 2021, which is the yellow points. So separated by about 10 years. And notice that they have very similar slopes, but they're offset by a bit. And the direction of the offset from 2011 to 2021 is down in the vertical direction. So that means towards brighter limiting magnitudes, which implies correctly that the night sky was brighter between those 2 points in time. And it's true over a pretty wide range of sky brightness values. The team that did this work, if you put this all together and you look at the whole world, their result from this, they concluded, is that during this period of time, this roughly 10-year period, the rate at which the night sky was getting brighter almost everywhere in the world was on the order of about 10% per year. 10% a year. And the way this got a little bit of pickup in the media when the story was reported, and the paper was out. And I liked the way that one of the stories put it, which was to say that when a person is born, if you consider the first 18 years of their life, so from birth to adulthood, they asked, by how much does the sky change for the typical person in the world? And a 10% per year change over 18 years means that in that time, from birth to adulthood, roughly half of the stars visible in the sky at the beginning of a person's life would have disappeared. That's a stunning statistic. Yes, it's concentrated more in the bigger cities. This is a problem mostly of cities, but increasingly that light reaches very far away from cities, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. So this is the punchline. Light at night is increasing at an alarming rate, and it turns out to have a lot of consequences above and beyond our ability to see the stars. I'm going to give you a little bit of context for the region that our chapter serves, and I'm going to start out by asking, what's the current situation on the ground? What I'm showing you here is a map of the region that has the outlines of where all the international border is, where the county borders are, et cetera. And I've done overlays with a couple of colors to indicate the amount of light pollution in those areas. One of those is the rainbow set of colors. There's a key down here at the bottom. As you go up from it would be, if this were not transparent, the center of this would be black, but you wouldn't be able to see very much. So I've eliminated that. But where there's basically no color, and you can see that satellite image behind, that's where the sky is essentially still unpolluted by artificial light. It's pristine, more or less. As you go up the ramp of colors from the blues to the greens, yellow, orange, et cetera, and even up to pink, which is where it sort of starts to go off the chart. That means a progressively brighter night sky, and consequently, you would see fewer stars in the sky. What it also means is more light on the ground. We know that there's a relationship that's now well understood between the brightness of the night sky and what we would call the illuminance on the ground, how much light is falling on a surface. So there's a connection there. I've also overplotted on this. You'll see there's kind of these little sort of jagged outlines where some of the colored halos are. That is a approximate representation of where the edge of the lit area is. That's the point at which our best satellite platforms for observing light pollution, that's where their sensitivity starts to fall off. So if you can see where those blobs are within the colors, that's about the edge of the built area where the light is coming from. And as you can see, there's good news here and there's bad news. There's good news in the sense that there's a lot of that you're seeing kind of transparent, which means that it's still essentially a pristine level of darkness. But then, from Phoenix on down through Tucson, there's also a tremendous amount of sky glow from our cities. Now, the next question is, what are the important assets that are in our region relative to this? And one of the things I'm showing you on here, the black symbols, the little telescopes, those are our professional astronomical observatories. And they still concentrate in the environment immediately around Tucson for the most part. They are worth an incredible amount to our local economy. U of A did a study a couple of years ago that they found that astronomy and space science here at the University of Arizona alone accounts for over $500 million worth of local economic activity every year. That doesn't count the other federal facilities and things like that. It's just the spending that flows through the university. So we think that total is probably higher still. Is it my mic? Okay, something is wrong. I'll switch over. Hold close. Technical difficulties. Please hold. All right, apologies for that. Thank you. Okay. So in addition to the observatories here, I'm showing you a couple of other things. The little blue symbols with the stars in them, those are called international dark sky places that are certified by the organization called DarkSky International, which is formerly known as the International Dark Sky Association. Their headquarters is here in Tucson, but they are truly an international, an NGO, a non-government organization that is making these designations all over the world. There are upward of 250 of them now scattered across the world on every continent except for Antarctica. And don't think we're not coming for the South Pole. But we have some of them right here in our own neighborhood, including not very far from Tucson. The red symbols are places that I would describe as aspiring international dark sky places. So they are either locations where we know efforts to secure designation are underway, or they are on sort of a hit list. They're places that we think would be good candidates for these designations. With the designation, in addition to the attention that it draws, can come important legal protections, especially for places like parks and nature reserves and that sort of thing. So we want to not only preserve the international dark sky places we have, but we want to expand their presence across southern Arizona. And then another question is, where do legal protections currently exist? And by that, I mean things like lighting ordinances. So some kind of a policy at the local or county level that governs the use of outdoor light at night and would presumably have some effect on lowering light pollution if it was well written and properly implemented. And anywhere that you see a green marker, those little green markers are the black stars, that is a city or county that has a lighting ordinance. They range in quality. Some of them are really good. Some of them are pretty basic. The markers that are red are counties mostly that do not have any kind of lighting ordinance. And then I marked Tucson and Pima County in yellow. They share a common ordinance between the two jurisdictions, and it is under revision right now. And we're trying to influence that process. So now I'm going to tell you a bit about what our chapter is doing, how we got this, how we got the band back together, as it were, set our priorities for our goals that we want to achieve in coming years, set up a strategic plan, and how we're now executing on that. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the organization that for the first 35 years of its existence was called the International Dark Sky Association is now simply DarkSky. The headquarters is called DarkSky International. The chapters are patterned off of that, so we are DarkSky Southern Arizona. So occasionally you'll still hear me slip up and say IDA, but what I mean is the central organization. And their structure nearly from the beginning is that the central organization is pretty small by NGO standards, even by US nonprofit standards, it's small. It really leverages the power of very eager volunteers who want to get out there in the world and make a difference and change things. And so it's the sort of hub of activity, the information flows through headquarters, they come up with resources and things that the volunteers can take out into the field. They really rely on those volunteers to do the work in the trenches that creates the change. So we are a branch of that called DarkSky Southern Arizona. And this is a picture from our reorganization meeting that we had in June of 2023. Several of us there that got together and had been in contact with the Southern Arizona chapter that had existed here since the 90s, but it had kind of gone quiet. Some people had some serious health challenges during the pandemic and indicated to us that they were going to have a hard time keeping going. And so we reached out and said, you know, would you mind if we kind of took the reins here and got this organization up and running again? And they said, sure. So we had an initial meeting to organize a few volunteers. That produced a handful of people who were willing to serve on the board, and then we were essentially off to the races after that. So one of the first things that we did was we held a public meeting last summer where we invited people who were on the chapter mailing list to come and learn about what our ideas were. And some of them stepped up and said they wanted to be part of the process for planning the new version of the organization. And we started off in typical organization fashion by defining who we were and what we stood for. And that in most organizational theory revolves around these things called mission, vision, and values. Our mission is patterned after the mission of DarkSky International, but it is tuned to our region in particular. And note that in that statement, we focus on people, we focus on communities, wildlife, and astronomical activities. So it's a recognition of the significance of astronomy in our region, but also the fact that this is a problem that impacts people and it has ecological consequences. And we want to address all of those concerns. Our vision is essentially elevating natural darkness to the level that it's a widely recognized natural resource and that it is a valued resource that people are willing to fight for. You know, we're willing to lead that charge, but we need a public that will support the kind of things that we're doing. And then we have this sort of word cloud here of what our values are. These are the kinds of things that are important to us. It's ways that we will address this problem, the ways that we'll work with other people. And it's kind of the stuff that you would sort of expect, but there's one in particular that I would want to highlight, which is the importance of awe. It's something that psychologists are just sort of finally coming to a grip with, that something that motivates human beings and grabs their attention and focuses it is the experience of awe, which is having connection with something larger than they are. So, you know, you go to the rim of the Grand Canyon and you've never seen it before and you're overwhelmed by what you see because it's so vastly bigger than a person. It's so much more time is represented by what you're seeing than the length of a human life. And so you start sensing that there's something bigger out there and for a moment you're connected to it. And we really want to try to leverage that as one of the ways in for people to this work. So this is a sense of who I think we serve with our efforts. We really thought about this very hard because we wanted to make sure that we were in alignment with as many stakeholders as we could think of. Of course, I put astronomers right up there in the top left because I do believe that's still one of our main constituencies, both in the professional and the amateur world. People still come to this part of the country from all over the US and even overseas to either to visit for the purpose of seeing the night sky, or some of them are amateur astronomers and they want a great place to have a backyard observatory. And so they'll move to our region. But we really want to talk to all of these different kinds of people and organizations because we think that together we stand a better chance of addressing the things that are of topmost concern to us. And that by forming alliances and partnerships with the groups that represent these interests, that we have a better chance of being successful in the long run. So we have a theory of change. I'm talking about a problem that I've set up that I showed you right at the beginning, kind of showed you how it affects things in our part of the world. we have a sense of where we want to go with this, right? We want the sky to be darker everywhere. We want conditions on the ground to improve. We want better nighttime visibility, et cetera. Those are all tied together. So the question is, how do we get there? And our theory of change is taken from the environmental playbook because we have now decades of experience affecting change in the environmental world. And also, I should say, through social organizations as well, tackling social problems that works very similar to this. And that theory goes that we start with rising awareness. A lot of people continue to move into our part of the country. Many of them come to Tucson and they ask, why are the neighborhoods so dark at night? Why isn't there a street light on my street? So it's this continual sense of raising awareness about why there's not a street light on your street and how that's important to the observatories and part of our identity as a region. We think that as more people become aware of the problem and its solutions, that they see the value in it, that they eventually say, you know what, we want this problem solved. And when we do, we start to point at the things that are, here are the public policies, here are the outdoor lighting practices that we know work, and I will show you evidence of that in a moment. And then from that, we go into the phase where they take it to their elected officials and say, all right, I want this written into law. I want this to be more durable than a set of voluntary activities, because the law reflects, in principle, what we want as a society. So that's how we think we're going to get there. Operationally, how do we do it? We need a strategy to produce change. And our strategy goes essentially left to right with these three pictures. We first have to educate, and then we have to advocate, and then we have to legislate. And I say that they have that order because it reflects those 3 points on the previous slide, right? We want to move from awareness of a problem to a desire for action, and from a desire to action to take that to the people in our community who are most empowered to create that change through the democratic process. So in the ideal world, this is how it works. We move from one side to the other, and eventually we start to see an improvement. But that's often not how it works. And so I've thought a lot about this in recent years and asked what's standing in the way. And one of the things that I think stands in the way is that we simply live in a sort of unique time in our history as a people. And it is a time when we are very split in opinions about absolutely everything. It's political polarization, but it's also how seemingly benign issues that once upon a time we would have largely agreed on are now turned into partisan issues. They're turned into situations that people oppose each other, not so much because they disagree on policy matters, but that they simply don't want the other side to get a win, right? I don't think that's a great way for us to run a society in the long run, and we're seeing some of the consequences of that. But the good news in our case is that I think despite that environment that we're in, that there's a lot more unity on this issue than one might think at first. It's very rare that I run into somebody in my advocacy work in this region who looks at me and says, I hear everything you say, and I absolutely do not care. And I'm not going to take any steps. I don't want to hear any more about it. This is something that is not of concern to me. Mostly people are interested. We have a great hook with astronomy and the night sky, although I think we're getting close to saturation with what we can do in terms of bringing more people into it. But still, people are motivated by that. They're captivated by this subject, right? It's a natural way in. So how can we bridge this gap right here? That's something that we're working on. And it's important that we recognize that the problem is bigger than a fear of the dark, although that does motivate very many people. And I say fear of the dark in the most literal sense, that people simply do not feel safe in outdoor spaces at night, and they want those spaces to resemble the daytime as much as possible because of an intrinsic sense that you're safer during the day than you are at night. And that, coupled with the rise of very inexpensive and highly energy efficient lighting, has led to the overconsumption of that lighting. So when you go back and look at that very first plot that I showed you with the pink and the magenta or the yellow lines, part of that is a consequence of this. It's that the resource isn't valued, the light is cheap and easy to consume, people think there's no consequence to doing so, and the result is we have this rapidly increasing amount of light pollution. But it's more than that. These are all things that I have heard from people that I've talked to in Southern Arizona that are concerns to them. What are the barriers to them being involved in this effort? And I've heard people say all of these things. And we have to take it seriously, just as we do when people tell me how afraid they are to go outside at night. I have to take that seriously because I know that fear comes from a very central place. It's visceral. They feel it. It's certainly not for me to dismiss it and tell them that their concerns are unfounded. I'm a scientist. I love data. I love supporting positions with data, but no amount of data is going to overcome somebody's innate fear. And once we realize that and tune our messages accordingly, they can start to be more productive. That's what we're doing as we go through this process. So I talked about astronomy a minute ago, and I said, this is great. We've got a hook. This brings people in, and I still think that's true. But I do kind of think we're getting to saturation on that. Same is true of the wildlife angle. Yep, people love animals. We tell them about how they're impacted by artificial light at night, but that crowd is kind of as many as we're going to get. And I would say, even though the public safety angle and the crime angle is important, that we're also nearing saturation there. We can only kind of scare people, if you will, to a certain extent before they say, all right, I'm shutting down. There's too much here for me to worry about. And we just play defense a lot. That's what we've been doing, I think, for the last several decades, since the beginning of the dark sky movement. So how can we go on offense? I think the key to that in the future is going to be more some of these things under the list of bullets on the right. Energy. Energy is going to be a huge problem in the future, just like the environmental situation with climate change is obviously starting to take a toll. Cost savings. Every time I talk to people in municipal government, all they want to know is how much will it cost. So reducing the cost of providing services to communities is very important to their elected leaders. And you'll do a lot better in convincing them to do whatever it is that you want to do if you play up the cost angle. And then I think we really need to talk about nighttime visibility. If we're recognizing and acknowledging the fear that people feel in outdoor spaces, we also have to give them an alternative to that. Even the words dark skies, I think sometimes are problematic because people think that means that the ground will be dark and that they, in order to get the stars, they have to give up something, namely their safety. So we really hit hard on this idea that dark skies doesn't mean dark ground. We want to improve nighttime visibility. We want to make it actually safer for you, in addition to giving you the perception of safety. We want real safety. And that comes in part from something that the lighting design community is increasingly referring to as lighting for reassurance, right? So a lot of the fear that comes, that people experience or that comes from these dark spaces at night is that they feel like they're likely to be a target. If you give them enough light to make them feel reassured in those spaces, and there's a little bit of research on this, their attitudes turn around very quickly. Researchers are measuring something that they call feelings of safety, and they look at that with respect to different light levels. And they find that adding just a little bit of light to a space that's otherwise dark causes the scores on feelings of safety surveys to go way up. But then doubling the amount of light and doubling it again and doubling it again gives you diminishing returns. And at high light levels, it flattens out, and there's some indications that it turns over because now people feel like they're on display, and that undermines the feeling of safety. I think we can do more in this realm that will bring people on board with the ideas that we're promoting. So what are our priorities? I've kind of given you the setup for, what are the headwinds that we face and how do we address these kinds of things? Our priorities come down to these four basic things. You've heard me talk already a bit about public policy. I have to give a great deal of credit to May sitting up here in front. She's been such an asset to us, turning up to meetings with City of Tucson. Like we're trying to get in with, the Pima County Board of Supervisors, and we need to find folks in the other towns and counties throughout our region who can go and be a presence. The more that elected officials hear the message, they see you coming, they know what you're there to talk about, the more likely they are to take some kind of action. We want to, as I said earlier, designate more international dark sky places in our region. They have tremendous value aside from just marketing value. We're doing education and outreach. That's been a core function of this chapter from the time that it was established. And also, we want to get more into the measurement and monitoring of light pollution. so that when the elected officials ask us, well, how serious is this problem in our area? We can give them numbers. We can produce the equivalent to sort of a local version of that chart that I showed you at the beginning, or other kinds of pieces of information to indicate that. One of the things we are trying to do specifically in that realm, and I'm going to bring this map up again, is to expand the number of monitors that are out there right now. This picture shows you everything is the same. Now those little purple symbols, that's that white thing in the center is supposed to be a camera. Those purple symbols are places that we know that there are devices that monitor the brightness of the night sky. They do it every night, all night long. In some cases, we already have access to that data. In others, we're trying to find the right people who own them to get that access. But we would like to put them up in all these places where there's a red marker, where there is not now a monitor to our knowledge. And we want to get, move that out to Western Arizona, for example, where there's just not a lot of going on in this realm at all. The focus is mainly on Tucson for good reason. But there's a lot of sensitive area out there, especially over at sort of the lower left along the international border, this area called the Sierra Pinacate. That's one of the darkest places in the lower 48 states or northern Mexico. And we're working with the Mexico chapter of DarkSky to place a monitor out there in the Sierra Pinacate Biosphere Reserve, which is a massive protected nature reserve out there. So that's one of our major projects, and it's something we're trying to get funded right now. So we went through this process of coming up with a set of strategic priorities. What are the things that we want to accomplish in a 2-year time frame that began this year? And we came up with these 6 key efforts that we've been putting energy into. And, so one of them is where it says launch the DarkSky network. That's that group of additional night sky brightness monitors that we want to put out there. But there are other things like we need to know where all the jurisdictions are in Southern Arizona and find out if they already have lighting ordinances. And then once we know something about that, we can start targeting our lobbying efforts. We want to make improvements where we can. We wanted a new chapter website. There was a very rudimentary and not very functional website from the previous chapter, continuing their legacy of education outreach and eventually get into not just communications, but again, strategic communications that have goals associated with them. So now that we're about a year or so into this, the question is, how are we doing on all this stuff? And we're making some progress. Like I said in the talk title, there's some hits and there's some misses, some areas that we're not as far as we would like to be, but we've done quite a bit. For example, we completely overhauled the website, and we've got a new and better URL for it now. So I encourage you to take a look at darkskysoaz.org, which is our chapter website. We have that database now of all of the ordinances that we could find in our territory, and we're beginning to chip away at figuring out, which of those jurisdictions are most likely to be receptive to efforts to try to improve them. We haven't come up with the resources to do the DarkSky network yet. That's going to be a big fundraising lift because there's a big material cost associated with it, but we have the plan ready to go, and we've been kind of starting to pull together some analysis software so that once we get the devices in the field, we'll begin to do something immediately with the data. And we haven't touched the strategic communications part yet, but that's going to be next for us. And I think that will be a big part of the first half of our next year. So far, I'm pretty happy with how things are going. So lastly, in the time that I have left, I want to wrap with pulling back for a minute and thinking about the bigger picture. I've been telling you, I started with the big picture, world's on fire, et cetera, but then narrowing it down pretty quickly and saying, there's a lot we can do on a local or regional level. What are those things? I told you about some of the things that we're doing to try to address the problem around here in this area. But I don't think that we can do it with just local efforts alone. So I want to tell you about ideas for the bigger and longer term efforts that we have in mind. One thing that we should definitely do is build on local success. I told you that I was going to show you an example of a situation where the kinds of solutions that we propose do indeed lead to the outcomes that we say they will have. And one of those is the streetlight retrofit program right here in Tucson. I showed you this before, so it's a little bit of a review. The important point here is when we upgraded our city street lighting system from a legacy system to a modern LED lighting system, we did so in a way that was, by its intent, not something that would have a bad impact on the night sky. And that's exactly what happened, that we did this successfully, and we reduced the impact of cities' street lighting on the night sky in the process. We did so in a way that is saving the city even more money, accounting for the capital cost of all the new lighting. And we measurably decreased the brightness of the night sky, especially at places far from the city. So at the observatories, places like Kitt Peak and Mount Lemmon and Mount Hopkins, we saw decreases of up to 10%. And we did so without dropping the intensity of the lighting at street level in Tucson. And so far as anybody can tell, we did it without increasing either overnight rate of traffic accidents or either violent or property crime. So if it's something that controls those influences overnight, it's not lighting. Because unlike City of Phoenix, which puts a streetlight on every residential block, we don't do that here. And if you adjust for the difference in population, our rate of overnight traffic accidents and crime is no different than it is in Phoenix. So whatever accounts for that, it can't be the lights. But we've reached the limit of what we can do with streetlights, unfortunately. It turns out that that's a big part of the light emissions of the city. And in the transition to the modern streetlights, we basically squeezed all the water we could out of that particular stone. Our streetlights are individually addressable, like computers in a network. So the city can send commands to them and have them do different things. And the lights respond back and tell them things like, how much power are you drawing? Or maybe this streetlight over here has gone out and needs to be replaced. And you don't have to worry about your maintenance crews having to figure that out by running around the city in bucket trucks. So what we did, we used this technology to our advantage and somehow amazingly convinced the city of Tucson to do an experiment for us. We said, could you put all the lights into different brightness configurations on a few nights, and we'll go out and see if we can measure it. And we did that, both through satellite measurements, so looking down on the Earth from above, but also looking up from below with night sky brightness measurements. And came up with the same answer, which is, it's always reassuring when you get the right answer, right? When your numbers agree. And we found that after the modernization of our streetlights, whereas before we expected that they accounted for roughly half of the light emission in the city of Tucson, that number is down to somewhere between 13 and 18% on average across the city. Now, there are some areas that it is still the dominant source of light, and that is this picture down here in the corner with all those little kind of pink hexagons. That's just a grid overlay on top of the city. And that was the spatial level at which we were getting these percentages. And you'll notice it over there, especially at the edge of the east side where there's just not a lot of development. It's not really a surprise that streetlights dominate there. But if you look at the area over here closer to downtown in the U of A area, it's much less. It's only 9%. In fact, the overall change made downtown go negative on this scale. So it's essentially zero. There's very little street lighting that's contributing to light emission in that part of the city. That means we need to start thinking about what other things can we tackle now that we've done the street lighting part. It's probably going to be private lighting in some form. We don't know exactly which yet, but I'm thinking of things like, big box stores with parking lots that the lights are left on all night long and there's no one there. Can we do something about that? I think we can. Along the way, we also, as I said, eventually need to write this stuff into durable law, so that we're not relying on property owners just doing things voluntarily. We're expressing the will collectively of people through the democratic process, and we need stronger and better outdoor lighting ordinances. And I think not only do we need to encourage voters to think about this when they make their choices at the local level, but we need to keep that periodically refreshed in their minds. It's great that we have a good lighting ordinance here. It's great that we're going through a revision that I hope is going to produce a good result. But if there's not popular support for it, it won't make a difference because it won't be implemented or enforced correctly. And if it's not enforced, then it's as good as not on the books at all. So that's on us to help people remember when they make choices for who they vote for, that this is one of the things that their elected officials are tasked with doing. But ultimately, I think we're going to have to aim bigger than all of this. We've been working the grassroots for so long, and as I like to say, there's a lot of grass in the world, and it's a lot of work to keep that grass tended properly. The other thing is that we have been doing this in a very highly localized way for a long time. So, working on just one jurisdiction at a time. And that turns into a game of whack-a-mole, because for every problem you solve, one pops up somewhere else. And if that's the pattern you get into, you don't make any forward progress. You're always putting out fires. And the main problem is that light pollution doesn't respect boundaries. So it's great that we have a good ordinance in Tucson. Some of the outlying suburbs don't have them. And as you saw on my map earlier, a lot of cities across southern Arizona don't have them. Counties don't have them. So what does it matter if we're doing things right here if they're not doing things great in La Paz County or wherever? We need a more comprehensive approach that goes up to a higher government jurisdiction in order to deal with this problem effectively. And the other thing that is a headwind for us is that the world at this point is tired, it's burned out, and it's restless. I talked earlier about the sense of division and political polarization that we face. Our attention is drawn to a lot of topics, and we're asked to care about all of it. It's hard to do that, admittedly. The political polarization and the social mistrust are a big part of that. And I think the pandemic changed us in ways that we're still struggling to understand and that we don't fully appreciate yet. But it might have changed the things that people value, and that includes the natural world. And so for us, that's a good angle to begin some conversations. So I think this comes down to a few goals. One is to eliminate as much of the waste as possible, in the same sense that, most of us look at this picture with the smokestacks in the background and we think, wow, somebody should really do something about that. That looks like terrible air pollution. And the fact of the matter is, at least at the federal level, we did something about air pollution, and it was tremendously successful. It's this little thing called the Clean Air Act, which clear air over your city, brought to you by Congress in 1970, deciding that pictures like the New York City skyline in the 50s over there on the left was not acceptable. And so what they did was they said, you know what? Air pollution is real pollution, and we don't want scenes like this. And we'll hand it to the newly created Environmental Protection Agency to write rules, and communities will have to follow the rules and reduce their air pollution, or they will be fined. This has been tremendously successful. What I'm showing you in this picture on the right, most of those colored lines, this is a trend with time. Most of those colored lines are the concentration of air pollutants in the air over American cities. And the detractors said, oh, you're imposing this huge cost on cities, and it's going to be terrible for the economy, and it's going to wreck things. The one line that's going up in that picture is the US economic output during the same period of time. And that just goes back to 1990, when there was a major amendment to the Clean Air Act. I think we could reproduce this success if we were to convince the powers that be that light pollution is also real pollution, and it has real consequences. The reason that the Clean Air Act didn't decimate the US economy, so the thinking goes, is it made people living in cities healthier. So they were missing fewer days of work and school, and they were more productive. And that productivity and the economic output it generated offset the costs of the program. I can give you other examples from environmental history. This is really successful when we all agree to do it, but it's tough to get people to sign on, especially in this time. Nevertheless, I think we need a Clean Night Skies Act. And I think that's going to have to take place at the federal level. We can do little experiments at the state level. California is great as an example. They've been doing environmental policy now in ways that have been leading the world in many respects for decades. And in many cases, the US federal policy has eventually come to mirror what California does on environmental matters. So this is something that we're going to try to push on a micro level here in Arizona and see if we can't get this moved on up. But I also want to see that lighting becomes part of urban planning and design. It's not an afterthought. It starts at the very beginning, so that any new project that's built in this city or this county or this state should follow a basic set of planning rules that are intended to improve nighttime conditions and ensure that there's not more light pollution as a consequence. Every jurisdiction should have a master plan for its lighting, not just an ordinance that tells people you can use this kind of light but not that, but they should actively plan for the way light is used. Tucson is a microcosm of that. I think we can export that idea. And I did mention this very briefly the last time I talked to you, but looking at different kinds of conservation models, especially those that have really worked out well here, is something that I think we should put more energy into, especially looking at water conservation districts. This is why we've managed to secure the supply of water in Southern Arizona for more than 100 years. We are doing better right now with water saving than we were approximately 50 years ago, even though the population has more than doubled in that time. We're using less water than we did, for example, in 1980. And it's because groups of governments across jurisdictions get together and say, we need to act collectively in order to preserve this resource. So if I do play the same sort of game and I take my light pollution map and I overlay a map of Arizona with associations of governments, you can see there are certain things that start to line up. You know, I'm looking at you, Maricopa Association of Governments. I think we can convince enough people that this is the right thing to do, and we want to try to pilot that right here in the Tucson area. And we're talking to some folks at U of A about that very idea right now. So that's where I'm going to leave it at for you. I encourage you to take a look at the update to the DarkSky International State of the Science report that was published a couple of months ago that lays it all out, all of the evidence. So all the great science and everything is in that report. Be glad to hear from any of you and talk about this further if you want to get in touch with me. And I thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
We have questions. Do we have questions in the room? If you could raise your hand. Jim is in the back and he'll take care of those, and I'll take care of the ones toward the front. So there's one in the back.
How many years ago? It was a long time ago. I live on Mountain, and they had the yellow solar lights, and then they took them away. So I never found out exactly how that happened. Do you know?
Yeah, I do know a little bit about that. That dated to the late 1970s and was part of an experiment that the city ran testing out a technology that was called low pressure sodium. And they had them here on the U of A campus for a long time as well. And they're about as good as it gets for astronomy in terms of the least impact on the night sky. And that was long before we understood that they have the least impact on ecology as well. They weren't especially energy efficient, and eventually the world moved to LED. And once that market took off, the demand for those lamps started to decline. And in 2019, the last manufacturer of the lamps, which was Philips, stopped production. So whatever is out there in stock is all that's left, and nobody is making them anymore. So it was an inevitability that they were going to have to convert them over to something. There is an equivalent technology in LED. It's called amber LED. It has a lot of great qualities, but right now it's a more expensive option, and there's less of it on the market than white LED. So we're having trouble convincing municipalities to look at it as a standard, but some of them are doing that, most notably Flagstaff, which adopted an amber LED standard when it updated its lighting ordinance very recently. So they're showing that you can do this, at least on a scale of a city with roughly 75,000 people. And it's going to be a bit of a sell to convince other people to adopt that too.
Thank you. Another question? And Jim is coming.
Thank you. Your presentation was great.
Thank you.
We were recently shopping for new lights because we know when we bought our house, it's out of compliance. And we were happy to know that in Tucson, people are getting tickets, and our salesperson did point us in the right direction to get the proper lights. But we live in Oro Valley, and I noticed there was not a flag on your map. There was one for Marana, but there was not one for Oro Valley. And we've raised very softly the concept to our HOA that we are upset with the local light ordinance not being not being written, not being enforced. Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
And so what do we do? Do we go to the city? Do we go to the HOA? How do we, as citizens and astronomers, get this going in our own backyard?
That's a great question. And I think Oro Valley actually does have an ordinance, and I may just have left it off the map. So if your community does have an ordinance, It's on the city government to enforce it. Most lighting ordinances are enforced on a complaint basis. So you have to bring them a complaint and say, I don't like this lighting installation and I think it's not compliant with the code. And then it's on them to do something about it. And they may do nothing, as many cities do. A lot of cities don't have anybody in their code compliance division that works at night. Or they may not have the equipment that's necessary to make measurements that can establish whether a situation does or doesn't comply with the law. So the degree you have to push on them depends on what they have for a compliance division. And in smaller towns, that can be maybe one person. We would like to catch a lot of the worst stuff before it goes in. So the other side of it is if you have a good ordinance is that you can encourage the city to do better with their review of permits, building plans, that sort of thing. But for most people, they don't know that bad lighting has been permitted until it turns on, and then it switches over to this complaint side. So part of this is that awareness aspect, right? Keep the issue on the table, keep it in the minds of the people who have the authority to do something about it, and keep saying to them clearly, the status quo is not acceptable. And the more of your neighbors you can get to make the same sort of statements, that will only help you because they'll start to realize, wait a minute, this isn't just a handful of people. This is something that matters to a lot of people in the community. So that's my advice is take some examples of things that are bad, take them to your city, your town government, and say, we want you to do something about these specific examples because they don't comply with the code.
John, I'm going to ask a question on the different categories. Is it true that there is a category for something like our Chiricahua Astronomy Complex that is kind of semi-private, not public, where we could get a dark sky status when we're not open to the public full-time?
Yes and no. The ability of the public to access the designated places it's really crucial to the program, and it's something that they've long insisted on. The matter is what amount of public access is enough. And there's no simple answer to that question, I'm afraid. It really depends on the circumstances of every location. There are some of the international dark sky parks that are open to the public maybe once a month, maybe once every other month. Then there are the ones that are on public lands that are open every night because the public is allowed in anyways, any night. So there's quite a range of variation in that. And being privately owned isn't an obstacle. There are several of the international dark sky parks that are privately owned. The question is, how readily accessible is it to the public, and is it sufficiently often for that access to be really meaningful? And in cases where you don't have a staff or a permanent presence, and you can only open it infrequently, that, for a lot of people, arguably and honestly, is a barrier to entry, I'm afraid.
John, I had a question as well. I had heard that that there was, I guess, some people now who were beginning to approach homeowners associations to have some kind of an educational program for homeowners association about light pollution and about lighting. And I guess my experience in Tucson is that that could be much used. And so I wonder kind of how is that operating, and if so, how it's operating.
And that speaks to the question about Oro Valley, because you mentioned an association. In jurisdictions where the local government isn't really all that interested in enforcing an ordinance if it exists, homeowners associations can be a great alternative to that. And one thing that we some time ago got an opinion from the Arizona Attorney General's office that homeowners associations in Arizona do have the right to add to their covenants things that are related to lighting, or in new developments, the first covenant set can have restrictions on lighting. So it's entirely legal to do so. And in many cases, they have a lot more latitude with enforcement than cities and towns do. So yes, the short answer is we need to do more awareness raising and education. If they get to the point that they say, we don't have anything in our CCNRs about lighting, but we're interested in doing that. We developed it at IDA, a set of model CCNRs. So you could go to your association board and say, here are a handful of very simple things that we would like to put into the covenants for the community that are related to lighting that you may get more uptake on than if you try to do it through the ordinance process. So yes, and we've got, we've got sample slide sets and all of that, and we can send people out to talk to their associations. I've done a few of those talks. So yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think, oh, we have one more question in the room. I'll come.
Thank you. A lot of talk about homeowners associations and compliance, but what about general education? I get your point that, the population is exhausted right now, but a glossy mailer that went out city and county wide, we have people move into our neighborhood in 2 houses and put garage lights on the outside of their garage that look like they're arc welding at night. And I think they have no clue. And so, after, a few months after the glossy political mailers are done, maybe a glossy mailer about maintaining what's important about our community, big box stores, and maybe approaching them. And I think it wouldn't be insignificant to get some voluntary compliance as people upgrade their outside lights and things. I think there might be some low-hanging fruit there.
I agree with you, sir, 100%. Really the only barrier to that glossy mailer is the cost. I was telling May just before the meeting got started, we've got all the information, the really key points distilled down into a series of statements that are so short they fit on the front of a postcard. And if you get nothing else across to people but 4 or 5 statements, that can be powerful because your window of opportunity is really short to get their attention. And when you have it, you have to hit them hard with exactly what you want them to take away. So yeah, if we had and we're thinking about how we could fundraise on that to do that kind of print collateral or similar kinds of direct mailers, or even getting them put into public spaces up on bulletin boards, which we can do with, without a lot of resources. I think a lot of it ends up being repetition. If they hear the messages over and over again, they move into a neighborhood and they hear the message again, and then they hear about it through, maybe we could get TEP to put something in people's electric bills or whatever, and they hear it again. You socialize them to these ideas, and then they don't seem so out of the mainstream anymore. And then people say, well, of course I'm supposed to shield my lights, because they know that's the law here. And I am extremely sympathetic to the arc welding intensity lights in front of people's garages, because I have a neighbor who's doing that right now, despite my efforts to explain why that might be a bad thing. So yes, it's very common. We just have to keep hammering on the messages. We're gonna try to do that.
I just want to make a comment that there's a next door social media group. And I often see on that group people saying, either the question, why is it so dark in my neighborhood? Or, something about the lighting that's too bright. And often somebody comes up and says, well, it's for the observatories. And so there is stuff going out to people, and they are learning it. I think for the most part, I don't see too many people commenting back, well, that's ridiculous or anything. So I think you're right. I think people do want to protect the skies, but using social media, I know we all get tired of social media stuff, but through the neighborhood groups, it's much more localized.
Yes.
And so I encourage you to think about that as a group.
And making the message local as well.
Yeah, right.
Right. So it's that old adage, in the environmental movement about it's acting local while thinking globally is what we're trying to get them to do, so that they're thinking about how will this affect my neighborhood. Make it a very selfish pursuit ultimately. You know, we care about the situation in your neighborhood in particular. And yeah, let's talk about why there's not a street light on your block, for example. And with the other things that, you know, you can do to ensure your safety at night that don't involve running street lights all night long when mostly nobody is out there to make use of them. Yes, exactly. And if we if we can find some of the younger and more tech savvy people out there in the world who want to run our social media, that would be fantastic.
Well, and it might be helpful, there could be these, but I haven't seen them, you know, to have some kind of brochure that says, what is safe lighting at night? And so you're able to show some pictures of that, or to, you know, kind of show that you don't have to have, you know, the streaming lights everywhere in your neighborhood with this, you know, and make it daytime all night, that there are other ways and other considerations in the kind of lighting. And most people don't know that. And maybe there could be a campaign to help people know that.
And a picture is worth 1,000 words. Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, I think we may have some questions online.
Yeah, so on Zoom, Wade Reynolds asks, are you in need of volunteers? What skills would be required of volunteers if needed?
The answer to that is always yes. And the skills can be anything. It's great if people have experience with community organizing or they've ever, you know, volunteered for a nonprofit. You do not have to know anything technical about this subject. We'll put you through boot camp so that you learn everything that you need to know. Enthusiasm is the most important skill, and everybody has that at some level. So if anybody out there who's listening is interested in becoming involved in this, please do get in contact with us. We've got plenty of things that you could do beginning tomorrow if you would like, and we'd be glad to have you.
Do you want to give a phone number or an email or something?
Yes, and I would say that the best way to do this is to go through our website. We have a contact form on there, and if you'll submit that and say you're interested in volunteering, you will hear very quickly from one or more from us. Or yes, just send me an email at one of these addresses. Send me an email on or message on social media, and we will get you connected.
I have to stop it now to get back. Oh, wait, maybe bring it up. Let's see. Someone you know quite well, Tim Hunter. John, wonderful presentation. What about the concept of allowing only so much light in a given region, like a county, for every new light and older one has to be taken out or reduced in output?
Yes, Tim, that is exactly what we have in mind with this idea of, we're calling them light sheds. Like you think of a watershed associated with a river system. And it's the same idea. You have deposits and you have withdrawals. And if you were managing a light shed actively through these regional conservation networks, it would be exactly as Tim described. You have a big new development that's going up over here and is bringing a lot of light, and that means you have to take it down somewhere else. And by take down, I don't mean in a way that threatens anybody. You, again, concentrate on reducing the waste. And so much of the light loss is that waste that doesn't benefit anybody. And so the kind of the concept in mind is, you know, our area will continue to grow. There will be more people living in Southern Arizona. They will have very legitimate needs for light. We have models for what that growth looks like. We know it's a certain percentage a year. Take the baseline condition, let it grow with population. But what we're trying to reduce is the hockey stick effect, right? Where the amount of light that we're seeing is vastly in excess of the population growth. And I think if we do this, if we set it to population growth and we're really aggressive about, yep, for every new installation here, you got to take something down here by cutting waste, we can achieve that. I have every reason to believe that that's true. So yes, in short, that's precisely what we're thinking about. And now we just need to find the jurisdictions that are willing to do this experiment with us.
All right. Let's see. P. Dan Hartog Can you utilize privately owned sky brightness monitors in your dark sky network? Do you have standardized equipment that is within reach of amateur astronomers?
The answer to that in short is yes. The equipment that one would need if you wanted to put one of these monitors up at your house with everything out the door is on the order of about $350 or $400. So it's not trivially inexpensive, but it's not completely out of reach. They're networked devices nowadays. So what we intend to do eventually is get all of these monitors online and have them reporting to a central database. So all the data is being archived so we can do research on it. But I want to put all of this online. I want you to be able to go to my map and click on one of those points and see what were conditions like last night and what were they like over 6 months or a year or 5 years or 10 years so that we can spot where all the trends are. So yes, if there is anybody listening who says, hey, I wouldn't mind putting up one of these monitors in my house, get in touch with us and we'll tell you how you can do that and start contributing to both science and conservation.
And I'll just tag on that. Last year, you had mentioned about the network, and that grant never really materialized.
No, it did not.
But
Not yet.
we would love to install something like that out at CAC, and I think he may
Yep.
even offer to help fund that. So we'll get in touch, and maybe we'll just go ahead and put something up out there, and we'll link it in whenever you're ready.
All right, we would be most grateful.
Yeah, I'm fully ready to fund the sky quality meter out there and would love to get that done whenever we can. So
Okay.
we can move that along. That would be
Let's talk.
wonderful.
All right, I think that's all we have on Zoom. If anybody, I don't know that I have all the chat up here, so if somebody asked a question earlier, if you want to put it in again, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll see if there's anything.
No, okay, so, and we don't have any questions from Facebook tonight. Well, while we're waiting to see if there's anything else on Zoom, I also want to thank our media people tonight. We have Jim Knoll, who's operating Zoom, and we have Terry Lappin, who's been doing our Facebook for us, and we have Susan Knoll, who's been doing our camera for us, and they all have to be pretty diligent through this whole process, and we very much appreciate that. So has anything else shown up on Zoom at this point?
No.
Okay. So any other questions in the room before we go? Or before we stop with this presentation, I guess. So John, I want to thank you so very much. We always appreciate your presentations and we learned so much. It's amazing. I've heard, dark sky presentations for for 20 years at least. I've heard dark sky presentations and I always learn something with every one that I hear. There's always this growth and development and, new things to think about. I mean, it's such a comprehensive, complex area and it affects all of our lives in so many different ways. It's always kind of hard for me to imagine the vastness of the impact of dark skies. So thank you so much for all the great work that you do in this area. We appreciate it. And as astronomers, we especially owe you for it. So
Thank you for having me back, Al. Thanks.
Okay, our next item on the agenda tonight is, I think, we're going to probably say goodbye to our Facebook people. Okay, yes, we could do that. So Eric, do you want to do your report first? Okay, wonderful. So Eric Krakashka, Dr. Krakashka prepares our regular monthly planet report that he posts on our website every month. And he also gives it in person. And we're, delighted that you're able to be here because I know last month you had to just post it, but you couldn't be here. So thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to start with a quick note about light pollution. Today, I came back from a trip to Iceland, Greenland, and Norway, and I saw a lot of light pollution, and I almost never saw dark sky. And of course, in those countries, there are almost no people living, so artificial light pollution doesn't exist. But the light from the auroras is so strong, it can cast shadow, and it sometimes covers the whole sky that you really cannot do any dark sky observations. If you want to do anything in these times, it's almost impossible. And the sun is so active right now that it wasn't that active since the last 22 years. And then next year it probably will start to decline. So it's an unusual time. When the sun is not active, you actually can get dark sky even at those latitudes. But now let's go to the planets this month. The brightest planet is the evening sky, Venus. It sets right now at 7:30 or so this month. And just try to watch it tomorrow evening between sunset and 7:30 because the moon is next to it. The moon is still a pretty thin crescent at that time. And it's about as obvious as Venus, and they are separated by 4 degrees tomorrow evening. And then towards the end of the month, on the 25th, Venus will pass by Antares at 3 degrees distance. Then next in the evening sky is Saturn. It's almost opposite to Venus. It's still in the east at evening twilight, and then in mid-evening it transits about 50 degrees high in the south. And the rings are now quite thin. They are 43 degrees wide, but only 43 arc seconds wide, but only 4 arc seconds from north to south. So it's kind of 11-to-1 ellipse. That's really interesting to watch, and it will get thinner towards the end of the year and into March, then when they disappear completely. It's a good time to watch the 6 satellites, the 6 brightest satellites in a telescope. A small scope at least shows Titan, but you can see more satellites than on Jupiter with some other telescopes on Saturn. Then the next planet further east is Jupiter. It's one seen Venus sets. It's the brightest one. It's quite bright. It rises 10 p.m. now. By the end of the month, 8 p.m. So it will become evening objects in the constellation Taurus. And it's as far north as it gets. Every 12 years it gets to that. It transits 80 degrees high. Mars follows a little later, around midnight now, but by the end of the month, 11 p.m. And it's getting to 0 magnitude, so it's quite bright. Its diameter gets to 9 arc seconds, and it's not a tiny disk anymore. You can see details when you look in a telescope, not quite as large as it gets to opposition. But it's starting to get there, to get interesting. And you can see it moving in near Castor and Pollux throughout the month. Those 3 bright objects, they change shape. They're triangle now, but by the end of the month, they will be in a line. Uranus and Neptune are also in the evening sky between Saturn and Jupiter. Uranus this year is about 5 degrees south of the Pleiades, so it's not difficult to find if you can find the Pleiades. Neptune is more difficult and fainter. What's interesting this month is the comet 2023 A3 to Qinshan Atlas. It's about magnitude 2, so it's really a bright comet that you don't get every year. There's a 5-degree tail or so. In the last week or two, it was in the morning sky, but now it's getting so close to the sun that within a day or two, it won't be visible anymore. It will be rising too late in morning twilight. But it's moving so fast that starting in a week, or a little more than a week, around the 11th of October, it starts coming up in the evening sky. And that's when most of us are observing anyway, so it's nicer. And it moves so fast away from the sun that by the 16th or so, it will be really well up in the evening sky, and it still will be bright enough to be interesting. Well, that's what I hope at least, because comets, you never know exactly what they do. But by the 19th, then there is no moonlight in the early evening. So at the end of astronomical, when astronomical twilight starts, at the end of twilight, and so those are starting on the 19th. Those are the days when you can watch it with a telescope in dark skies, and it's probably fading then, but until the end of the month, it's still quite nice. It moves from constellation Virgo through Serpens to Ophiuchus, and the motion is so fast right now. It's at about 7 degrees per day, and then by the end of the month, it will have slowed down to 2 degrees per day. When it's as fast as 70 degrees per day, when it comes out in the evening sky, like around the 11th, 12th, 13th or so, it's really interesting to watch it in a telescope because you watch for a minute or two and you see the comet wandering by a nearby star, or the comet forms a nice triangle with two other stars, and the triangle is constantly changing shape from minute to minute. And you cannot see that with many other objects as well. And at the end, I want to just mention the Draconid meteor shower. On the 7th at midnight, it has its maximum, and this year maximum may be especially high because they predict that the Earth can get through dense regions through it. May only last a half hour, so it's just around the 7th at midnight where we could get a surprise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krakashka. I'm also going to kind of stick an announcement in here. I hadn't warned Jim about this, but I wonder, Jim, if you would also make a little announcement about our new Instagram account.
Sure. Yeah, so about a month or so ago, we did set up set up an Instagram account, so we're a little more social media active. So we not only have Facebook, which we have about 11,000 followers on, so our Facebook account is doing very well. Instagram, we have about 15, so if anybody wants to follow us, that'd be great. Instagram is not really as conducive for what we want to do because it's really more visual and short, some more pictures. You can't like stream a meeting to it or anything like that. I think the longest videos that you can have on Instagram is like 9 or 10 minutes. So it's really more for being able to take pictures, of events and things like that, which is what we're going to utilize it for. And if anybody wants to help out with that, that would be great. We'd love to have more posts going out that. But yeah, so we basically have Facebook, Instagram, and the website, and then YouTube. So that's where we're at right now.